So we have some important news in the current efforts to remove suppressors and short-barreled rifles from the NFA nationwide in light of the new $0 tax change that's now in effect. The Trump DOJ and AG Bondi continued to defend the NFA in once again a new challenge. So let's talk about what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, please consider subscribing to the channel. That of course helps the channel to grow. Also double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed you. And I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to protecting yourself after a self-defense incident, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always expanding upon their benefits. One of the new benefits that they actually have is they're guaranteeing 4 self-defense attorneys to your case if you find yourself in an incident. So I highly recommend that you check them out. You can use the link down below. And if you sign up using my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $25 off of your plan. So in this video, we need to talk about what is happening right now in response to the Big Beautiful Bill and the recent $0 tax change that's now in effect. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that HR 1 passed, and in it, we only got the reduction of the tax. It went from $200 now to $0. Now, in response to that, multiple organizations filed lawsuits, and the goal of that was essentially to remove the remaining suppressor and SBR restrictions and to essentially do away with the NFA outright. For example, GOA, FRAC, Silencer Shop, Palmetto State Armory, Silencer Co. in 15 states joined together to file a lawsuit against the ATF, and that is down in the Northern District of Texas. But there is another lawsuit that was also filed in the Northern District of Texas, and that's a case called Jensen versus ATF, and they're seeking essentially to do the same thing. In fact, one of the viewers here on the channel is actually the named lead plaintiff in that case, and recently that case was also assigned to Judge Matthew Kaczmarek. Now, you may remember the judge's name there because Matthew Kaczmarek has been very favorable when it comes to 2A issues. He's issued rulings striking down the ATF's pistol brace rule, some 80%er rules, and other cases as well. So it's a very favorable judge, especially in this federal district court. Now, recently in this case, the plaintiffs decided to file for a motion for summary judgment, and the ultimate goal of that is to end the NFA, sooner rather than later, get rid of the remaining restrictions in light of the new $0 tax. In this lawsuit, the plaintiffs argue that since there is no longer a tax on these items, no longer a tax on suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs, there is no longer a valid constitutional basis to further regulate these items under the NFA. In the lawsuit, they argue that suppressors are protected arms and that they are used for lawful purposes. They state that a suppressor is a safe, effective, and commonly used device that decreases the noise level of gunshots. Suppressors improve the experience and use of firearms. They decrease the risk of permanent hearing damage, help protect the hearing of hunters and those nearby, reduce noise pollution from firearms discharges, and make firearms training safer and more effective. They state that contrary to the representations in movies and television, suppressors do not reduce all sound from gunshots and rarely are used by criminals. They argue also that SBRs are protected arms and they cannot be classified as dangerous and unusual weapons. They state that short-barreled rifles plainly are arms under the plain text of the Second Amendment. Their use can only be restricted, therefore, if they are both dangerous and unusual. Short-barreled rifles are not dangerous and unusual, they state. The Constitution therefore guarantees the right of peaceable citizens to possess and use these items. This, along with the fact that the Big Beautiful Bill has now eliminated the NFA tax on these items, essentially means that the remaining NFA restrictions on those items should be struck down. They go on to argue that the NFA's registration and related requirements on untaxed firearms exceeds now Congress's enumerated powers and are thus unconstitutional. Congress, they state, passed the NFA explicitly premised on the fact, and so the Supreme Court actually upheld the NFA as an exercise of Congress's taxing powers. They state that as a result of the Big Beautiful Bill, nearly all of the firearms now covered by the NFA, except for machine guns and destructive devices, are now untaxed, yet the comprehensive registration scheme to make, transfer, receive, or possess those firearms still remains in effect. In summary, what the plaintiffs here ask for in this case is for the court to declare that the NFA's registration and transfer requirements pertaining to these now $0 taxed items goes beyond Congress's enumerated powers, because this was all based on the taxing powers, but now there necessarily is no longer a tax on these items. They also asked for the court to enjoin all the ATF's employees and agents from implementing or enforcing the NFA's remaining restrictions against these now untaxed items. So that is what this new lawsuit aims to do in response to the NFA tax change that just passed in the Big Beautiful Bill. And now the plaintiffs are asking for Judge Kaczmarek to grant them a motion for summary judgment and, rule in their favor before this goes to a full trial and essentially strike down all of these remaining restrictions. Now, in response, in this case, the Trump DOJ has filed an opposition, and they also filed for their own motion for summary judgment, and they argue that Judge Kaczmarek should instead rule in their favor, grant the DOJ's summary judgment motion, and deny what the plaintiffs are asking for. In the brief, the DOJ argues that the NFA remains fully constitutional despite Congress's zeroing out the certain, NFA taxes on these items under the Big Beautiful Bill. According to the DOJ, they argue that the plaintiffs' main arguments are essentially wrong. They argue that the NFA is not, a tax. That's what the plaintiffs are arguing, but they claim here, the DOJ is claiming that there is still necessarily a tax on these items. They state that while the making and transfer taxes for items like suppressors and SBRs and AOWs was set to zero, they argue that Congress explicitly actually preserved the NFA's special occupational tax on manufacturers, and that remains on manufacturers, dealers, importers, along with the entire registration and approval framework. This is where the DOJ believes that there is this web of regulation that remains in place, and that the tax is so important for this web of regulation that the court here should not simply just strike down the NFA. The DOJ argues that these regulatory requirements are still valid and is still a valid exercise of Congress's taxing powers because they directly support the assessment, collection, and enforcement of that remaining tax. Separately, the DOJ contends that even if the taxing powers were somehow insufficient, they believe that the NFA is independently justified under the Commerce Clause and then also the Necessary and Proper Clause as well. The government stresses that the NFA primarily regulates an interstate commercial market on firearms, covering manufacturers, distributors, dealers, and purchasers, and explicitly actually reaches interstate transportation and transfers as well. So they believe that this touches, interstate commerce, and therefore the Commerce Clause would also be at play even if the taxing power was found invalid. Now, on the Second Amendment question and on the Second Amendment issues that were raised, the DOJ maintains that the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit precedent already forecloses this challenge, and they assert that the NFA's regulations are presumptively lawful and consistent with the historical tradition of firearms regulations because they claim these are dangerous and unusual weapons, and they're dangerous and easily concealable, and therefore they can be regulated. As a result, the DOJ argues that Judge Kaczmarek should reject the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment and instead grant their motion and dismiss this case. So there are a lot of moving parts right now when it comes to this whole NFA battle. There are cases in multiple district courts, courts of appeals, and also recently we saw that there were 2 SBR cases seeking Supreme Court review, but ultimately those were denied, which was unfortunate. But there have been a lot of cases trying to move and expand upon this new $0 tax. But this case I will especially be keeping my eyes on because of the jurisdiction and also the favorable draw of a Judge Kaczmarek, who has been very solid when it comes to 2A issues, especially dealing with the ATF and the DOJ. And now the plaintiffs are moving to end this case at the district court level, as soon as possible. And they're asking for Judge Kaczmarek to grant their motion for summary judgment and remove all of these remaining NFA restrictions. But of course, like I mentioned, the Trump DOJ is opposing that and arguing instead that they should win this case right here and now. So that's what's currently going on in this critical case. As we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm. Also, you can check out one of the 2 videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.